Hi. So I was kind of bored last night and I'm kind of getting over a cold. And my head was in a space where I wanted to make a video, like a scripted video, which is not something I've ever done before. It's not scripted. I don't have a script. I have notes, which are on my screen right now. Um, but I've never done this before. So I'm just gonna try and do this while I'm getting over a cold. This sounds like a good idea. Um, So this video is about how to understand necrodancer racing. Um, if you don't know what crypt of the necrodancer racing is, I'd like to know how you got to this video. But if you do, or if you need a reminder, I guess, um, necrodancer racing is you and one other person play crypt of the necrodancer. You both stream your screens. You both play in a seeded all zones mode run, so that you both start with the same dungeon. And then you play on the same seed as each other until one of you beats the game. And that person's the winner. Um, this is a great thing to do competitively, and I've done it a lot. And that's why I wanted to talk about it. So, no, it's not. Oh, okay. First point is the items. Your build's the only thing that matters. It's not entirely true. It's like kind of mostly true. A lot of this is because of your weapon. Um, because making sure that you have a good weapon is like it's like 90% of winning a race. Like, sort of. um, I see a lot of races that get very. They come down to one player, like, missing out on some sort of strategic resource or some sort of advantage, and then they're unable to, like, check a black chest on a boss, or they're unable to pay for a conjure or afford something in a shop, and then they, like, miss out on a weapon or on a crucial damage up or something, and their weapon is bad and they just lose even though the rest of their build is the same. The weapon is the most important thing. The items are also just all very important. If you're playing against someone who's like kind of within your same skill level, you really, really need to not fall behind on the items. Um, you can beat someone when you have worse items than them. We'll get to that. And you can just do that with skill, of course. But most races, one of the most crucial points is who gets the right items, or who, making sure that you get the right items. It's not that there's a lot of races that come down to build difference. It's just that one of the most important skills is getting a good build. Um, the most entertaining races are not decided based on items. Generally speaking, generally they're something else, because if there are quite a few races which are like one person found this weapon and the other person didn't, and now the first person is just way ahead. That's not very exciting. So that's part of that's part of the issue, I suppose. And I find it kind of interesting how important items are compared to how much they're talked about, because a lot of the like discussion around the game is around very minute details. Like you'll watch a race and you'll listen to it being commentated, and the commentators will be talking about all sorts of very interesting things, but what doesn't really get mentioned very much is like, oh, well, this person missed their flawless in 1-4 and then they didn't get a weapon, and now all of their energy was focused on trying to get a weapon, while their opponent could focus on getting other items, and then it just kind of snowballs out of control, and then they can't really catch up anymore. And I don't hear people mention that effect very often, which is a little weird to me. It makes some sense. And it's also kind of boring to just be like, well, this person made one mistake, and that was the race. And you don't really want to do that, because that kind of makes people feel bad. But it doesn't come up at all, which I find a little weird. Um, and the other thing that is important is who is playing the game, which should not come as a surprise. Any good competitive sport should rely on who's playing the sport, I think. I think necrodancer is a sport. It's an esport. Just because it's not a super popular one doesn't make it not an esport. But there's a lot of different ways to play the game, like a lot of different ways. A lot of different ways to balance going fast versus being safe versus getting items versus just making sure you're getting to the exit quickly every floor. But like none of them are like better than the other. Like if you look at even if you look at within the same tournament or across a bunch of different tournaments, you'll see a whole variety of different playstyles and different approaches, and none of them really like turn out to be better in over a large sample size, which I think is one of the beautiful complexities of the game. Like you just get to play how you like, play how you enjoy, and like it's probably about as good as everyone else's strategy, or not their strategy, but their approach. Strategy's a bit different, I think. You can try and lean into chance, and like in individual races, there's um, definitely ways that you can try and turn, you know, lean into those tail end of the like, oh well, I shouldn't have won this race, but I got all these things to go right for me. You could totally do that, and we'll talk about that more later. But leaning into chance like that is not going to like let you succeed in the long run. Like you can't. Chance is not a replacement for skill. Um, and even with all this in mind, you could still maybe you're not playing to your opponent exactly, but you are definitely rewarded for understanding what your opponent is able to do and the type of player they are, and like just knowing like are they going to be more aggressive in the early game, are they going to be more aggressive in the end game, like if like do you need to prioritize making sure that you're ahead going into zone 4, like what's the difference here, and and be, everyone's different, and it's really important that you well it's not like super important, you cannot really know what your opponent's doing at all and still do just fine in most races, but it definitely rewards you to pay attention, which I think is cool. It's just another way to express one's skill, I think. Next point, oh boy, this is a big one. So screen watching is strategically relevant, meaning that it like is like a huge part of like the fundamental rules of the game. Like some people hear that screen watching for some roguelike games that do racing, or for any video game that does racing, I think the more common approach is to disallow screen watching, so you don't know what your opponent's doing. You're kind of just doing your own thing, and that's that's fine. There's obviously nothing wrong with that. But necrodancer just historically has not taken this approach, and it kind of changes the game in a whole bunch of ways. And when you approach it at first glance, you might think that it's like, oh well, I know when my opponent has died, and if I'm quite a bit behind them, then I can just know where the things that they found are, and I can skip them if I don't want them or something. And that's all true, of course, but it goes so much deeper than that, in a way that you might not expect. And there's like two major differences between racing and speedrunning. One of them is screen watching, because you need to be able to respond to what your opponent is doing, and also to make sure that you're not giving them too much information to respond to, which you don't need to worry about while speedrunning. And of course, the other difference is that speedrunning is aiming for the flukiest highs, and racing is a lot more about consistency. Because you do need to win a lot of races to do well in that tournament setting. Um, and this kind of breaks the rules of the game and outside the game, because out of the game, there's a phenomenon which has come up in the past couple years, but has always kind of been a thing, which is there's no like it doesn't really matter how far ahead of your opponent you finish. So as long as if you're any amount ahead at the end of the race, you win. So it kind of makes sense to want to be as close to them as possible, so that if they ever get ahead of you, you can immediately take advantage of that information. And the way that this comes to shove in the most obvious way is at boss chests. Because what can happen is you could be a little bit ahead as you're killing a boss, and you go up to the chest, and, the boss chests are fairly random. You don't know what you're going to get out of them. And you can just wait and see what your opponent gets, because you can look at their screen. And you can wait and let them go first. You can wait either by literally just sitting in front of the chest, or you can wait by looking around to get more items or something on a previous floor or something similar. And this isn't just a boss chest issue. You could do this in a shop, in a transmogrifier. This is kind of a big thing in the Conjurer, or when you're throwing your dagger at the blood shop, because that's a random teleport. The only reason that isn't a huge giant issue is because the blood shop is always right at the start of the run, and so you could just throw out the blood shop, and a lot of the time you're not losing more than 20 seconds, which is kind of a big amount of time, but it's 20 seconds. You can work around it, especially that early into the race. And when you get into these situations where two racers are sitting on the boss screen and they're waiting for each other to open the boss chest, because it is strategically advantageous for both of them to do so, there's kind of no way to solve that issue, and you just get into a stalemate. And as of recording, this is not really an issue that has been resolved in any competitive tournament sense. It's just kind of disencouraged. A couple of the times that has happened, it's just one of the tournament organizers will go into the race chat and just tell both racers to pick one after 3 seconds. So they will, or one of the racers will just be like, "Ah, fuck it, I'll go and do it." So it kind of breaks the rules of organized play a little bit, which is kind of interesting. In an outside observer sense, it's not very fun to deal with, but it is interesting, I guess. It also breaks the rules of the game that you're playing, the Crypt of the Necrodancer video game, because while normally you don't how do I say this? If spending a minute in zone 1 and spending a minute in zone 5, that's a minute in a speedrun. Those are the same amount of time. I mean, obviously there's the same amount of time in a race too, but if you're a minute behind in the early game in a race, you also get to be looking at all of the things your opponent is doing and gaining all of that information. So you're being behind is kind of good, especially in the early game, which is weird. You wouldn't expect being behind to be good. That just doesn't make very much sense intuitively, but I think it's true. And I have been in or watched other people race. I've been in races myself, and it's become like, oh, well, I'm in this race with this person, and we both know we can go very fast, but we're both going kind of slow because we're both so focused on what the other one's doing and making sure that we don't miss anything important. Um, yeah, because you really don't want to not be able to have the really good item because it becomes a situation where, well, oh, if I start going on ahead and my opponent explores a little bit more and they find this good item, then they can just blast off ahead of me and I can't do anything about it because I can't go back for the item. It's a very strange dynamic, but it'll that'll take me into the next point, or the inflection point specifically, which I already kind of talked about this, but so Zone 4 and Zone 3 are both kind of unique in their own ways. Zone 3 is kind of just this giant hodgepodge mess of a zone where it's really hard to consistently find the exit all the time. And the floors really are a lot harder if you don't find the exit right away. They do take a lot longer, and it's a big deal. And then Zone 4 is almost entirely the opposite. It's not entirely the opposite because they're both kind of skill based in their own ways. But Zone 4 is very mechanical skill. There's very little swishy stuff. It's you know exactly where the exit is. It is just get to the exit as fast as you can. You know where you're going. It's just hard to get there. The floors take a long time, except if telemonkeys happen, but that's an entirely different issue. Yeah, so that is it's an important part of the race. 3-4 in particular is after that random element of Zone 3 is over, and then right before Zone 4 starts. And because the reason it's kind of the reason I'm calling it the inflection point is that if you have two racers with about the same builds, the same set of items going into 4-1, the better player, at that point, it is almost entirely just that the better player will win every time. And like in a way that is not true at the start of the race. It really changes the dynamic. And so it kind of becomes important that either when you get to 4-1, you either want to be quite ahead of your opponent positionally, or you want to have a better build than them. So that, or you just want to be the better player, of course. And that is kind of crucial. And I think it is trying to capitalize on how the zone structure is set up makes for a strategy where you can spend a lot of time looking for items early, let your opponent go ahead of you, and then you have a bunch of items, and they've shown you all the Zone 3 exits, and then you can just rush through Zone 3, and then you're a little bit behind into Zone 4, which kind of sucks, but you have a lot more items than them, so you can probably win, and you're probably safe, and, you know, that, like, it's not like that this is a bad thing, that this is a strategy or anything, but it is not something you'd expect to be possible. The main point I'm trying to make, maybe I'm letting it get confused a little bit, is that being behind before Zone 3 is hardly a disadvantage at all, because your opponent will probably get lost a little bit and lose a lot of time that you can just save by making sure that you pay attention to where the exits are. And so Zone 3 is kind of this very important... As the design of the game goes, as far as racing goes, Zone 3 is a very... The reason... How do I say this? The fact that it's designed the way it is a really big deal, I think. This is my opinion. All of this is my opinion. No one else has seen any of these slides before recording this. This is all me. And this is also called rubber banding, I think, because you're kind of able to snap back to being much closer to your opponent than you might expect if you were just a viewer. This doesn't happen only in Zone 3. It can occur anywhere, because if there, like, anywhere in the game, there can be like a particularly bad layout or a particularly good trapdoor or a particularly important item, and being behind your opponent at any of those points is an advantage because it makes sure that you will not miss that thing. So while it's a race, and obviously being ahead in the race is good at the end, there's a lot of incentive to be behind for a lot of reasons, and those two things kind of create a tension, which is very interesting. And it interplays in ways you really wouldn't expect. I don't really feel like I've done the topic justice here, but I don't exactly know what else to say. It's almost something you have to experience, or at least to watch to understand, maybe. So changing a little bit here, I think that there are 3 kind of general skill sets for this game, or for racing this game. One of these is micro, which is kind of a very simple, like, just play the game well, like, in quotes. You just don't want to be taking random hits from enemies. You want to make sure that you don't waste money by, spending your coupon on the wrong item. You want to not accidentally aggro enemies that you don't want to be fighting. It's just like the little things, the little tactics, right? And that's like, you just played the game a lot to get better at that, right? You just need to do a lot of repetition. And then there's macro, or what, farming well. And then this is a little bit different. It seems similar, but there's an important distinction between macro and then meta strategy, where you're putting your macro into the right spots. And basically what I mean here is that, like, farming well is saying, okay, I'm on this floor, or I'm in zone 2, I need to get a couple of important items out of this zone 2 in order to win. And the way I'm going to do it is by doing this. And so, like, doing a good job of checking the right shops, or of not going out of your way for items that will cost more time than they really should, than they're really worth, that's good macro. Meta strategy is more like deciding whether or not you should be farming at all. Like, you can do a good job farming, but you can do too much of it and kind of get bogged down with that, and that's kind of a weird distinction to make, I guess. Because, oh, well, if you're farming too much, then you're not doing a good job of it. And it's like, well, not exactly. You want to be spending, you want to know how much time you want to spend farming, and you also want to know how to make the most out of that time. And the first of those is meta strategy, and the second of those is macro. Maybe that's a good way to put it. And I think all 3 of these are important, and all of them can be traded off for each other. And being good at one of them kind of gives you more freedom and flexibility in the others. If you're good at farming, then you don't have to be as good at the tile-to-tile movement execution, because you'll have better items, you'll have more items, and it won't matter as much if you take random hits, for example. You can be the opposite. You cannot be really that great at knowing if you should be checking shops in the meta strategy area, but you can know that you're good at the tile-to-tile movement, and so you're always going to be able to be pretty fast no matter what, because you're just not spending that much energy checking for items, for example. And I think all of this is very interesting, and it's cool that there's these different skill sets. And even if you just, wanted to make, like, oh, every player is just, 3 integer numbers that describe how good they are at these 3 things, like, even then, like, that kind of demonstrates that there's a whole lot of different ways to be good at the game. And even within these areas, it's very hard to know what the best, quote unquote, best way of doing any of these might look like. Um, because the game is so hard and so complicated. And so like just kind of being good at them is definitely good enough because you're never gonna be optimal at them. Um, and then on the complete other side of the coin, from the strategic skill side of things, is luck or variance, which I don't think are the same thing, or at least not exactly. Um, luck is, in my eyes, the difference is that like luck is when you kind of just stumble upon something. You really can't like make a choice to have better luck. It just happens to you, or it happens to your opponent, and and it probably causes some emotions because it doesn't really feel like that should have happened, quote unquote. No one made a decision for it to happen. Variance is different because it looks a lot like luck, and it can make skill be less of a factor, but you can intentionally cause variance. Or another way of putting it is build deviation or seed deviation, which is like kind of specifically going out of your way to create scenarios where you have items or you have a build that's fleshed out in a different way from your opponents. And so like depending on what good items show up later, they might end up just favoring your build or favoring your opponent's build. And it just becomes less of a skill-based game at that point, it becomes more of a luck-based game. But it's still kind of skill-based because you are still making the choice to make that happen. If you're the lesser skilled player, you can choose to try and make there be more variance in your race, and that will be beneficial to you. That is a way you can express your skill at being a racer. Because of course this is only at all an issue in racing. In speedrunning, you know, it doesn't matter what you could have found on the seed, it only matters what you did find. But for racing, it does matter what's on the seed that you didn't find because your opponent might have gotten it. And this is this is like really, it is an important part of racing to know when you're behind in some way and to try and force the game to, maybe you put yourself in a situation. Peace Shrine is a great example for this because Peace Shrine, you can either bomb it to get the Ring of Peace, which is a good item, or you can hit it and it will refill your health, and then you can bomb it and enchant your dagger, and then that will give you one of the special daggers. And there's kind of like on the surface level, well, there's like variance in that you can get the electric dagger as one of the options some of the time, and the electric dagger is like probably a quote unquote better item than the Ring of Peace. But kind of the important thing is that the Ring of Peace is like a ring and it goes in the purple chest, and the weapon goes in the black chest. And so if the next boss has a good weapon and a bad purple chest, if you take the peace ring when your opponent took the weapon, the enchanted dagger, then you'll end up in a much better position because now you have peace and a weapon, and they only have a choice of two good weapons, or maybe they have a weapon and like a kind of mediocre ring or something. And now you're in a better position, even though, you didn't know that those things were coming. So it's kind of luck, it's kind of chance. It's not within your control, but you are trying to influence the race and to try to take that skill gap out of the equation as much, which is a very cool thing that you can do. Because it's hard to do this. It's still a form of expressing skill. It's definitely not. It's not that people who try and lean on this are, they're being good at the game just in a different way. They're kind of being good at the more meta racing level of the game rather than Crypt of the Necrodancer itself, so to speak. And of course, luck and variance are both affected by chance, and so it can feel bad. Like people complain about it a lot, people talk about it a lot, people blame a lot of things on luck and variance, and they maybe don't acknowledge that skill factor as much as they should. Because, yeah, if you and your opponent kind of choose to do slightly different things and it leads to a big difference in builds or in speed and outcome in the race, it's going to feel kind of bad because it's not like you could have known ahead of time. And if you're the more skilled player, if you feel you're the more skilled player, you might feel upset about that. And it's reasonable to feel that way, of course. Um, and I really don't know how much any of this matters in terms of like I don't know how much luck and chance affect races, like especially at the top level. Like it feels like that it's kind of a big deal, but it also feels like it really isn't. And I don't have a great way to articulate that. And I've thought about it a lot. I just don't have a great idea of how much this sort of luck or this sort of variance can. I don't know how much impact it has on the racing scene as a whole right now. Like if you tried really hard to remove any of this, because the more recent Synchrony DLC did make a lot of changes to reduce seed variance in the sense that there were a lot of little things you could do that would cause like butterfly effect things to be different in the seed later, which is not exactly the same thing as what I'm talking about. Like there's kind of a difference between, oh, we both found the obsidian rapier later, but I had the ring of peace from earlier and they had the weapon from earlier, so I ended up in a better position. That's kind of different from, oh, the game started generating different dungeons because of this different decision we made, and I got the rapier and they didn't. Those are kind of two separate things, right? And the Synchrony DLC kind of tried to reduce the latter thing from happening, which I think is a good thing. And I don't really think that doing that. I think doing that has discouraged, the kind of like following from behind strategy I talked about earlier a little bit, but I don't know how much impact it's really had on the competitive scene. And it feels like that should have been more obvious than it was. And all of that's very interesting, and I don't really know what to make of it. So there's food for thought. I definitely don't know everything. Okay, and then there's the endgame. I'm specifically talking about cadence on this slide. Everything I've said before this point can kind of apply to racing as a whole for any character. But cadence racing is really the only one that has been played competitively for any length of time seriously. So that's what I'm talking about now. Endgame, or specifically the two bosses that Cadence fights at the end of her run, Deadringer and the Necrodancer, are both very interesting fights, because for the most part, items don't do much of anything on either of those fights. And so it's like, oh, well, once you get to Deadringer, then it's completely skill-based, because it's just what both players know how to do, and because they're both kind of deterministic fights. And it's like, well, not really at all. But kind of, yes. And because most of the items don't matter at all, the ones that do kind of they kind of are given an undue importance because, well, those items help you in the endgame when very few items will. They make an impact where nothing else really can. And there's like 3 or 4 of these items which are already pretty good, and they just get made way better than they really ever should be because of the bosses at the end of the game. And then there's another 3 or 4 items that really only have utility as endgame items. And that's kind of interesting as well. And what I'm talking about is like, well, there's items like the Blood Drum or the Blast Helm, which make digging through the stage of the Necrodancer or make killing Deadringer a lot faster. And those items are already good to begin with. But like the Blast Helm is like really good in its own right, and the Blood Drum has, it has a moderate amount of utility, but it is a lot better because it is good at the end game. And then there's something like the Glass Shovel, where you can use it to get an extra free hit on the Necrodancer, which does make a difference. It's definitely a big deal, but Like, the glass shovel isn't a good item other than being able to do that. It's kind of just a meh item. It's not remarkable. Um, but it is made more important by the fact the necrodancer fight is always waiting for you at the end. And this is also kind of the point where there's a very weird amount of variance, because Deadringer and Necrodancer are, in theory, very consistent, very rehearsed fights. You do them every run. Because your items don't matter that much, you're kind of doing the same thing at the end of every single run. So in theory, you should be pretty good at it and know what to expect. But at the same time, the fights are both random enough, especially the Necrodancer fight, where you can really end up in situations where there's you kind of just end up losing 5 seconds because of bad luck or something. You just get a bad spawn or a bad teleport because you did something slightly differently, and that just sucks, because you really would like the end game, especially those races that like both get to the end bosses at the same time. Those are the closest and most tense races. You really want those to be down to skill. You really don't want it to be, oh, they both played so well, and then one of them got a much better teleport, and then, completely ran away with it at the end. Like, that's awful. That's boring. You don't want that. But sometimes that happens. It's just part of the game, I guess. And yeah, I don't know. I like these end bosses. I think they're cool, but they definitely do. They definitely can have an effect on your. It's strange, because you'd think like, oh, the Necrodancer's in every run. I should practice the Necrodancer a whole lot, because if I'm able to like save 10 seconds every run on my lures, like I'm going to be done 10 seconds faster every time, and that's great. That's kind of true, because yeah, being good at the Necrodancer fight does save you 10 seconds compared to not being so great at it. But at the same time, it's at the very end of the run, so there are the fewest races where it makes a tangible impact on the race, because you have to be within 10 seconds of your opponent at the very end for those 10 seconds to matter. And how many races end, there's actually quite a few races, especially at the top level, where that end within 10 seconds of each other, like a lot more than you might expect for a random game like this, which is really cool. But, it's still not that many overall. So any time that you spend practicing the Necrodancer, if you're not coming within 10 seconds of your opponent finishing, you're not really benefiting from all that practice. But then in the races where it does matter, it matters a whole lot. And oh god, like it's so weird that it's such a pivotal part of the run, and it also feels like it only comes up like a fifth of the time at most. It's strange. Maybe, I don't know if I've made my thoughts clear. I hope I have. Yeah, that's it. That is certainly not all I have to say, but it's all I have on this slideshow. Necrodancer is such a hard game that the person who wins, maybe like none of this matters, because both players can be really good at racing, and maybe one of them is just having an off day and they make a couple mistakes and then they lose their race, and that can happen 3 times in a row, and they just lose their set of 3 without really being the worst player in any way. So none of this matters, but also it matters a whole lot, because if you have 2 players race and one of them is notably better than the other, then they'll probably win like almost all the time. And yeah, it's a video game.